Chapter 5, Physical Development in Infancy. In this chapter, we're going to cover physical growth in infancy, progression of infant motor skills, and sensory and perceptual development in infancy. The first thing we're going to discuss is the patterns of growth in infancy. So these charts are from your textbook, and the first chart you can see it's showing you how rapidly babies grow during the first 2 years of life. So you have green is their increase in height, and blue is the increase in weight. So from birth to 1 year, those lines are the steepest, and then as they're still growing, it starts to get slower and slower. The rate of the growth slows down. And the second chart, you can see that not all parts of the infant's body grow at the same rate. At birth, the baby's head accounts for 1/4 of its body size, and as the child grows, the rest of the body begins to catch up. So your textbook talks about two different patterns of growth as well. The first one is cephalocodal pattern. So this one states that the earliest growth always occurs at the top. So for example, the eyes and the brain grow faster than the jaw. An infant can use their hands before they can crawl or walk. So it starts from top down. And then the other one is proximodistal pattern, which states that growth starts from the center of the body and moves toward the extremities. So infants can control the muscles of their trunk and arms before they control each individual hand and finger. And again, this is just showing you, I thought this was on the other side, but this is showing you from top down and then from the inside to the outside. So for brain development, the infant's brain has relatively few neuron connections at birth, as you can see in this chart. But during the first 2 years of life, the brain will establish billions of new neuron connections. And as it does, those connections become increasingly complex as they learn. This is important because as more neurons develop, more connections and more complex connections, it promotes cognitive growth, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. But there is a video for you to watch on this that talks about synaptic pruning. So you should watch that and then do the assignment, the first assignment for this chapter. Continuing on with brain development, we talked briefly at the beginning of the semester about sensitive periods. So again, remember, a sensitive period is a time where any kind of negative effects can alter development. So talking about brain and neuron connections, in this stage, if they have extreme sensory deprivation, this can result in permanent brain damage and loss of functions, because at this age, children are learning a variety of skills, such as social skills, verbal skills, their motor skills. So those can all be impacted by sensory development, sensory deprivation. So I have an application here that is talking about the Romanian orphanages. Essentially, this is a story that was covering how the quality of these orphanages were very poor, and they had way too many kids living there and not enough adults to take care of them. So what they found was that the children that were adopted after 6 months they had been in the orphanage for more than 6 months and then they were adopted. They had persistent intelligence deficits and mental health issues. And this was a common issue that they found in these orphanages. Children that were adopted by 6 months of age were able to score an average on mental test scores, whereas Romanian children who were left in the orphanage were adopted much later showed a significant intellectual deficits. So some research suggests that these experiences can be overcome. So the neuroconstructionist view states that biological processes and environmental experiences influence the brain's development, and that the brain has plasticity, which means that it can change based on experience. So that's influenced by your environment, and brain development is closely linked to a child's cognitive development. So if you had an infant who was born into this situation, they do have the ability to potentially change based on their later experiences in life. So really quickly with nutrition, nutrition is very important in the first few years of life. I mean, it's important throughout the lifespan, but especially in the first 2 years because of how rapidly infants grow. So if they're not fed properly, then they're not going to grow properly. Breastfeeding is especially important. So if a mother is able to breastfeed, then they should, because it has many benefits for the infant and for the mother. Um, some cases where a mother might not be able to breastfeed include if she's has any kind of diagnosis like HIV or something like that, AIDS, or if she's having to do chemo, those kinds of things might prevent her from being able to breastfeed. But if she can, it's really recommended that women breastfeed. You can read more about nutrition in your textbook. It's pretty straightforward on how much babies should eat and the effects that that can have and stuff like that. Next, we have motor development. Motor development comes in two forms. We have gross motor development, which refers to the control over actions that help infants get around in the environment, such as crawling, standing, or walking. So basically, you can think of it as gross motor development as your big muscles, so your arms and legs. Whereas fine motor development has to do with smaller movements, such as reaching and grasping. So typically think of smaller muscles like your finger movements and those kinds of things. So it's gross and fine motor skills. The dynamic systems theory of motor development is the mastery of motor skills involves acquiring increasingly complex systems of action. When motor skills work as a system, separate abilities blend together, each cooperating with others to produce more effective ways of exploring and controlling the environment, like control of the head and the chest, aid in sitting. Also, kicking and rocking on all fours combine for crawling. So it's basically just saying that you progress as you are able to combine a bunch of smaller movements. And I do have videos of these different things in Blackboard for you to watch and some of the different motor skills that infants would have at this stage. Next, we're going to talk briefly about sensory and perceptual development. So the research has found that infants are actually able to perceive the world with some order, but it's a lot different than how we perceive the world as adults. So first, we're going to talk about visual perception. So only hours after birth, infants show a preference for human faces, attractive faces, and their own mother's face. And I have a video again on Blackboard for you to watch of that. Infants are also attracted to contrast colors, and they prefer to look at patterns rather than plain objects. So contrast colors would be like black and white. They would be attracted to looking at something in black and white versus something that is like red and pink. And again, they like patterns rather than plain objects. Here's an example of some colors and patterns and stuff that is made for infants that they would enjoy. There's also a depth perception video on Blackboard that talks about one of the studies in your book where they are looking to see if infants can determine when they're reaching the edge of a drop off. So there's a video of that for you to watch. Some other senses, hearing. After birth until about 3 months, infants cannot hear soft sounds. They have to be more like conversation volume level, and they can't hear low pitch sounds. For smell, newborns can differentiate between odors. Based on their facial expressions, infants seem to be able to indicate that they like the way vanilla and strawberry smell, but do not like the way rotten eggs and fish smell. For taste, the fetus learns different tastes in the womb through the amniotic fluid and in the breast milk after birth. Even 2 hours after birth, infants have been found to demonstrate different facial expressions when they taste sweet, sour, and bitter solutions.